Snow, steel, silence, and then the thunder of 10,000 hooves. In the frozen winter of 1240, 100 men made 10,000 of the most feared warriors in history turn and flee, not with better weapons, not with reinforcements, but with something the Mongol Empire had never faced before: men who refused to die. Picture it. 100 exhausted warriors standing in a narrow valley, staring down 10,000 fresh Mongol cavalry. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the last free warriors of the Northern Rose, the final barrier between the Mongol horde and the total erasure of an ancient culture. The odds were 100 to 1. The chance of survival was 0. And yet, by the end of this story, you'll understand how terrain, psychology, and raw northern stubbornness combined to create one of the most impossible victories ever recorded. You'll see how the Mongols' greatest strength became their greatest weakness. You'll learn the forgotten Viking battle technique that neutralized horse archers by the thousands, and you'll discover how a frozen river changed the fate of an empire. But here's the detail that makes this story truly unsettling. The Mongols erased this battle from their records. Why would the most successful military machine in human history want to forget a single skirmish? What made these warriors different from every other army the Mongols crushed from China to Poland? And how did word of this clash spread fear through the entire Golden Horde? Their commander, remembered only in whispers as Bjorn the Unbreakable, achieved what military historians later called impossible. How could infantry survive arrow storms that had annihilated civilizations? How could 100 men psychologically break thousands of veterans who had never known defeat? To understand how 100 men stopped an empire, we first need to understand the terror that was sweeping the known world. Because what happened in that nameless valley wasn't just a battle. It was the moment when mathematics bowed to mythology. By 1240, the Mongol Empire moved across the world like a living apocalypse. From the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, no force had resisted their revolutionary style of warfare. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in days. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands simply vanished. This wasn't conquest. This was annihilation on horseback. Take Kiev, the jewel of the Ruslands. Before the Mongols arrived, over 50,000 people lived behind its walls. After 3 days of Mongol attention, fewer than 2,000 traumatized survivors remained. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies, they erased societies. Their message was brutally clear: surrender and live as slaves. Resist and watch everything you love become ash and bone. The secret to Mongol dominance was a terrifying combination of speed, range, and fear. Each warrior commanded 3 to 5 horses, allowing them to ride for days without rest. Their composite bows could punch through armor at over 300 yards, farther than most enemies could even see clearly. But their most powerful weapon wasn't steel or sinew. It was terror. They cultivated fear with intent. Pyramids of skulls marked their advance. Refugees carried stories of unstoppable demons who drank blood and devoured the hearts of brave men. Long before Mongol scouts arrived, cities were already surrendering. But in the frozen forests of the north, something survived that the Mongols hadn't calculated for: the Varangians, the last echo of the Viking Age. These were not the raiders who once terrorized Europe's coasts. These were their descendants, hardened by centuries of war, carrying traditions forged by men who believed death in battle was the highest honor. They were anachronisms, warriors from a dying age facing the military future head-on. While the Mongols perfected mobility and distance, the Varangians still fought in shield walls, They still believed in old gods. They still wielded massive two-handed axes that had once split Saxon shields and Frankish helms. By every rule of military logic, they should have been swept aside like dry leaves before a storm. The strategic situation was desperate. Mongol forces under Batu Khan had already crushed Volga Bulgaria and annihilated the Rus principalities one by one. Their next objective was Novgorod. Control the Volga corridor, the ancient trade artery between the Baltic and the Caspian, and the last free northern lands would fall. This task was given to a force of 10,000 riders under Noyan Chagatai, a commander forged in the furnace of Chinese and Persian campaigns. His men were veterans who had shattered fortress cities and sent European knights fleeing in terror. They moved through winter forests like wolves, hunting the last resistance before spring. What they found instead was 100 men who had already made their decision. In a nameless valley between endless forests and the frozen marshes of the Karma River, the last free warriors of the north chose their ground. They knew they couldn't run. There was nowhere left to flee. They knew they couldn't hide. The Mongols would find them eventually. So they did the one thing the Mongols never expected. They planted their feet, raised their shields, and waited. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the valley. 10,000 riders advanced through forest paths like a living serpent of bronze and leather. Their approach was announced by the jingle of bridles and the rolling thunder of 40,000 hooves. These men were veterans of 20 conquered cities. Each warrior carried 2 composite bows and 3 quivers of arrows. Silk armor beneath leather turned blades and slowed arrowheads. Spare horses followed every rider, ensuring relentless pursuit or instant retreat. They were the ultimate military system of the 13th century. Against them stood 100 men who looked as if they had stepped straight out of the sagas. The Varangian 100 were not common infantry. They were the inheritors of the elite guard tradition, descendants of warriors who once protected Byzantine emperors and carved their names into the stone of Hagia Sophia. Each man stood well over 6 feet tall in an age when most barely reached 5.5. Their mail hauberks weighed nearly 50 pounds, hand-forged rings riveted in the old style. Their weapons told deeper stories, pattern-welded axes passed down through generations, round shields of northern oak bound in iron, painted with symbols unseen on battlefields for a century. And among their best fighters, the terrifying Dane axes, 6 feet of ashwood topped with crescent blades, capable of cleaving horse and rider in a single stroke. They had chosen their ground carefully. The valley was barely 200 yards wide, flanked by dense forest that would break any cavalry maneuver. Behind them, a frozen river cut off retreat, but prevented encirclement. Ahead, the land sloped upward, forcing attackers to charge uphill through a narrowing funnel. Their commander, Bjorn the Unbreakable, stood at the center. 60 winters had turned his beard white, but his arms still swung an axe younger men could barely lift. He had survived the Battle of the Kalka River years earlier and learned Mongol tactics the hard way. Now he made his final stand. The Mongols began with their usual theater of terror. War drums thundered. Cries rose in a dozen conquered languages. Horsehair banners snapped in the frozen wind, symbols that had presided over the fall of empires. Then something unsettling happened. The Varangians answered with nothing. No war cries, no drums, no movement, just silence. 100 men stood like carved stone, breath misting in the cold air. No fear, no defiance, just waiting. The Mongols had faced screaming armies, praying armies, armies begging for mercy. They had never faced this. At first light, Chagatai ordered the arrow storm. 5,000 bows bent as one. The sky darkened as arrows arced through the morning air, each shaft capable of punching through mail and flesh alike. This rain of death had shattered armies from China to Poland. The Varangian shields rose in practiced unison, overlapping like scales. Arrows slammed into wood, iron, and mail. A few men grunted as shafts found arms or legs. But the line held. The second volley followed, then the third. For 10 minutes, arrows fell like winter rain, shields bristled with shafts. Still, not a single man broke formation. The psychological impact rippled through the Mongol ranks. Every enemy they had ever faced had faltered under the arrow storm. Men always broke when death fell from the sky. These men did not. Chagatai ordered a feigned retreat. 1,000 riders surged forward, loosing arrows, then wheeled and fled, shouting insults and challenges, trying to draw the Varangians into open ground. They didn't move, not one step. By mid-morning, frustration crept into the Mongol ranks. Horses slipped on melting ice near the frozen river. Scouts muttered about northern magic. Stories resurfaced of Varangians who had once served emperors and chosen death over dishonor. The valley had become something else entirely, and the worst was still to come. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Chagatai's patience finally snapped. No more probing, no more tricks. No more softening the line with arrows and fear. He would solve this the way the Mongols solved everything, with brutal, unstoppable math. 10,000 against 100. He selected 500 of his finest heavy cavalry, men who had shattered armored knights in Europe and ridden down armies that outnumbered them. They formed up in disciplined ranks, lances lowered, horses stamping and snorting steam into the frozen air. The drums started again, slow at first, then faster. The rhythm crawled into the bones. This would end it. The charge began at a trot, then gathered speed as they descended the slight slope toward the Varangian line. And for a moment, it looked exactly like every other Mongol victory. A wall of horseflesh and iron, a moving storm, an oncoming fate. But the valley did what Bajorn had designed it to do. The ice betrayed the horses. The narrowing funnel compressed the riders, forcing them closer and closer together as they picked up speed. They couldn't spread out. They couldn't slip around the edges. They couldn't use the space that made them deadly. 200 yards. The Varangians didn't move. 100 yards. Still nothing. 50 yards. The Mongols lowered their lances for impact. 25 yards. And then, it happened. A roar exploded from 100 throats at once, a sound so sudden and so primal it felt like it came from the earth itself. Not a chant, not a cheer. A violent, ancient scream, like wolves announcing the kill. The effect on the Mongols was immediate. Horses already struggling on slick ice flinched at the noise. The tight formation wavered. Riders bumped shoulders, lances jostled. The clean line twisted into a messy knot at the exact moment it needed to be perfect. And then the charge hit. It struck the shield wall like thunder trapped in a barrel, wood cracking, metal shrieking, horses screaming, men roaring in languages ripped from conquered lands. It was chaos made physical. But here's what should not have been possible. The shields held. Not barely held, not held for a moment. They held like a cliff face. The front rank had braced their shields into frozen earth, shoulders locked against shoulders. The line was a single organism. Every impact rippled across it and was absorbed, distributed, swallowed. Lances that should have punched through infantry shattered against northern oak. Horses, unable to stop on ice, slammed into the wall and reared, exposing riders for the first time. And that's when the Varangians answered. 100 axes rose. 100 axes fell, not wildly, not individually, in unison. The Varangian counter-strike was mechanical in its precision and horrifying in its brutality. Dane axes swung by men trained since childhood carved through Mongol armor as if it were cloth. 6-foot blades found horse necks, rider ribs, collarbones, faces. The sound wasn't heroic. It was wet, final. In heartbeats, the snow changed color, white to pink to deep crimson. Mongol elite cavalry, the pride of the horde, dropped like wheat before a scythe, and then the valley did something even crueler. The dying horses didn't fall cleanly. In that narrow space, on ice with pressure behind, they piled up. Thrashing flesh and broken harness became a living barricade. The second rank, charging too fast to stop, slammed into their own dead. Horse into horse, rider into rider, panic into discipline. Now the Mongols weren't just attacking the Varangians. They were trapped by their own momentum. This is where the math of 10,000 against 100 began to rot. The valley was too tight to flank. The ice stole footing. And now, a growing wall of corpses blocked forward movement. The Mongols' greatest strength, mobility, was being strangled by geography. In the press and confusion, a 16-year-old Varangian named Eriksson found himself face-to-face with a dismounted Mongol veteran. The Mongol's horse was dead, but his will was still sharp. He came at the boy with a curved saber, the kind that had cut down knights, peasants, and anyone unlucky enough to stand in its reach. Eriksson didn't run. He'd been raised on stories of Ragnarok, trained to believe that fear was something you swallowed, not something you obeyed. Axe met saber, strength versus speed, youth versus experience. For 3 heartbeats, they traded blows in a cramped pocket of slaughter. Then Eriksson's axe found the gap between helmet and shoulder. The Mongol went down, blood pouring into the crimson slush. And Eriksson, still alive, did something that made the scene feel human again. He wept. Not because he was weak, because he was 16, because he had just become a man in the ugliest way imaginable. And even as he cried, he lifted his shield again, because the next attacker was already coming. Chagatai watched his heavy cavalry die and felt, for the first time in his career, the cold finger of doubt. But he was Mongol. Retreat was not a word he allowed into the air. He ordered the second wave. 1,000 riders, lighter cavalry, meant to exploit the gaps the heavy horse would create. But there were no gaps. The Varangian line hadn't broken. It had barely bent. The mounted archers surged forward, firing at close range. Arrows came flat and hard, searching for the soft places. Eye slits, neck joints, the tiny spaces where mail ended and flesh began. 3 Varangians fell, arrows buried in their faces. For an instant, it looked like the line might finally unravel. But then the shields shifted, sliding smoothly like a single creature closing a wound. Fresh men stepped forward. The wall reformed. The Mongols expected rage, a reckless charge, a desperate surge to avenge the fallen. Instead, the Varangians took one single step forward. Just one, synchronized, deliberate. The psychological hit was brutal. They weren't just surviving, they were advancing. The second wave reached the pile of dead horses and had to slow, had to pick their way through the mess. And as they hesitated, they entered the killing ground, the exact distance where Varangian axes could reach. But Mongol sabers and bows couldn't work the way they were meant to. It became a nightmare of geometry and blood. Dane axes swung in tight arcs, chopping through lighter Mongol armor with terrible efficiency. Riders toppled into the muck. Horses slipped, screamed, kicked, fell. The funnel claimed them one by one, and then came the sound that turned the battle from impossible into cursed. A berserker's roar. One Varangian, overtaken by battle madness, broke from the line. He threw aside his shield, gripped his axe with both hands, and charged straight into the Mongol mass. It was the fury of the old gods made flesh. He killed 3 in his first rush. His axe painted red arcs through the morning air. 5 more fell before the Mongols managed to put arrows into him. Still he came. 7, 9, 12. By the time he finally collapsed, his body was so full of shafts, he looked like a head shaped like a man. But his death bought something priceless. Fear. The Mongols had seen warriors die. They had never seen a man ignore death like it was an inconvenience. Then Beorn the Unbreakable stepped forward. 3 arrows hit him almost immediately, shoulder, thigh, side. He didn't flinch. He reached up, pulled each arrow out with slow, casual motions, never breaking eye contact with Chagatai. Then he tossed them aside like they were trash and raised his ancient axe in challenge. The message was clear. Pain means nothing. Wounds mean nothing. Only the line matters. And then nature joined the slaughter. The morning sun had warmed the valley just enough to turn the ice into something worse. A slick red bog. Snowmelt, blood, churned earth, and slush mixed into a sucking mess that stole balance and destroyed footing. Horses struggled, hooves sliding, legs sinking. The Mongols didn't just lose their advantage, they lost the core of their identity. Mobility died in that crimson muck. Driven by rage and shame, Chagatai ordered fire arrows. Oil-soaked rags were tied to shafts, lit, and sent arcing toward the shield wall. Fire had broken cities from Samarkand to Kiev. Fire was the universal fear, the destroyer of walls, the destroyer of courage. The Varangians had seen fire before in Byzantine service. They knew exactly what it could do, and still they held. Flaming arrows struck shields, struck mail, struck flesh. 2 Varangians became human torches, their screams ripping through the valley. Their brothers dragged them back. The suffering ended with merciful axe blows. Fresh men stepped forward, filling the space without hesitation. The wall endured, now bristling with arrows, streaked with blood, flickering with flame. By the 7th hour of fighting, the heap of horse corpses had grown into a grotesque monument nearly 6 feet high. Mongols had to climb their own dead just to reach the Varangians. Every assault became slower, harder, more expensive. Steam rose from the valley like the breath of dragons, hot blood meeting frozen air. Then the Mongol commanders noticed something that made their stomachs drop. Arrows were running low. Every warrior had started with roughly 120 shafts. Thousands upon thousands had been fired. Most were embedded in shields or lost in the muck. Quivers began to empty. For the first time in living memory, the Mongol arrow storm faltered. Whispers spread through the horde. These weren't men. They were northern demons. Odin's chosen. Einherjar who couldn't die until their time was appointed. How else could 100 hold? How else could they shrug off wounds? How else could they keep stepping forward? And then the Varangians did the one thing that broke the last fragile piece of Mongol confidence. They advanced again. One step, then another. The shield wall, decorated with arrows dripping red, began to move like an avalanche. Only about 70 still stood, but they came forward anyway, slow and relentless, crushing everything in their path. Their war song rose, ancient and rough. older than churches, older than kingdoms, a chant about glory, death, and halls of the slain. Chagatai, watching his men hesitate, felt something new. Not anger, panic. If his soldiers would not break this wall, he would do it himself, or die with his honor bleeding out into the snow. He seized his lance and formed the final assault. 2,000 riders gathered behind him, the best remaining warriors of the force. This was no longer about winning a valley. This was about the myth of Mongol invincibility. And if that myth died here, in this frozen trench of blood and corpses, then the empire would bleed everywhere. What happened in the 7th hour still chills the blood. The final charge did not come as a wave. It came as a hammer. Every remaining mounted warrior compressed into a single brutal fist of steel and fury aimed straight at the center of the Varangian line. Chagatai rode at the front, his personal banner snapping in the wind, his lance leveled at Bjorn's chest. This would end it, one way or another. The impact shattered the valley. The Varangian center bent, then buckled. For the first time that day, Mongols punched through the shield wall. Horses leapt the mound of corpses. Sabers found northern flesh. Shields splintered. The careful geometry of defense collapsed into a chaotic knot of bodies. This was no longer tactics. This was murder at arm's length. Men slipped on blood and ice. Axes buried themselves in skulls and stuck. Swords broke on mail. Hands grabbed, bit, clawed. The air filled with screams in a dozen languages, the smell of iron and smoke and wet fur. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like the Varangians might finally break. And if they broke here, nothing would stop the Mongol tide from flooding the last free lands of the north. But they did not break. As the sun dipped low, painting the valley in red light, the impossible hardened into inevitability. The Mongol charge, the same force that had shattered kingdoms, began to collapse under its own weight. Chagatai's lance thrust forward, but Bjorn stepped aside with the calm of a man who had already said goodbye to life. His grandfather's axe came down in a wide, unstoppable arc. The Mongol commander's horse screamed and folded beneath him. Chagatai rolled free, came up fast, saber in hand, and found himself face to face with the white-bearded giant who had ruined his world. For 10 heartbeats that felt like 10 years, the two commanders circled in the press of bodies. East met north. Speed met mass. The future of warfare met the past that refused to die. Chagatai was faster, younger, unwounded, but Bjorn had something else. He had already accepted his death. When Chagatai's saber slid into Bjorn's side, Bjorn didn't retreat. He trapped the blade with his own body, locked it in place, and brought his axe down one final time. The sound was dull, final. Chagatai fell. His skull split like kindling, and with him fell the Mongol will to fight. It began close to the body. Warriors nearest their commander took half steps backward, staring at the white-bearded figure still standing, despite wounds that should have killed any man alive. Those steps spread outward like ripples on water. Within moments, discipline dissolved. 10,000 of the finest warriors on earth turned their backs, not from strategy, from fear. The Varangians did not pursue. They couldn't. Of the 100 who had stood that morning, 31 lay dead among the corpses of men and horses. 68 still breathed, but barely half could stand without help. The valley was no longer white. It had become a crimson marsh, reshaped by slaughter. Here's the part history rarely explains. In 8 hours of continuous combat, 100 men endured nearly 40 separate charges. They withstood over 50,000 arrows, enough to erase an army. Conservative estimates placed Mongol losses at more than 800 dead, with hundreds more wounded. The core of Chaghatay's force lay twisted in frozen mud, their certainty shattered. Bjorn the Unbreakable lived long enough to see the Mongol banners vanish into the forest, long enough to speak his final words. "Tell them, we held." Then the accumulated wounds claimed him. 7 arrows, 3 deep saber cuts, countless smaller injuries. He died standing, hands still wrapped around the axe that had drunk so deeply of Empire's blood. The immediate consequences were staggering. Leaderless and shaken, the Mongol force abandoned its planned strike on Novgorod. What should have been a swift winter campaign turned into a retreat of shame. The detour around the Valley of Death cost them 3 weeks. 3 weeks that allowed northern cities to prepare defenses and spread the impossible story. But victory demanded its price. As night fell, the survivors faced the arithmetic of triumph. Eriksson, no longer a boy, wept openly as he recognized friends among the dead. Wounds were treated with brutal battlefield care. Arrows pushed through instead of pulled out. Mail cut away from swollen flesh. Snow packed into wounds to dull the pain. Those who would not survive the night were given the mercy stroke by their brothers. Their eyes turned north toward homes they would never see again. The dead were not abandoned. For 3 days, despite exhaustion and infection, the Varangians burned their fallen in the old way. Each man laid out with his weapons, mail cleaned, faces arranged in death's calm. The pyres burned high, visible for miles, a message to any Mongol scout watching from the trees. This ground was paid for in northern blood, and it would be honored. The story spread faster than the Mongols ever could. From Kiev to Novgorod, refugees carried the tale. 100 men, 10,000 riders, the invincible horse stopped by farmers with axes. The story grew in taverns and halls, around fires and among the displaced. Some said Odin himself had stood in the line. Others swore ancient heroes rose from their graves to fight once more. But for the Mongols, it got worse. Chaghatay's defeat could not be hidden from Batu Khan. The loss of nearly a full tumen to a handful of men was unthinkable. The psychological damage spread through the horde like disease. If 100 desperate men could do this, what could 1,000 do? 10,000? For the first time since they rode from the steppe, doubt took root. Forest terrain, once dismissed as inconvenience, became feared. Every narrow valley became a potential death trap. The mathematics of conquest, always favoring speed and numbers, now carried a new variable. Terrain could turn advantage into liability. You think you know courage? Courage is standing in a shield wall when every instinct tells you to run. Courage is pulling arrows from your own body so you can keep fighting. Courage is watching friends die and stepping forward anyway. Courage is choosing where to make your stand and making it matter. The Varangian 100 proved something timeless. The immovable object does not need to destroy the unstoppable force. It only needs to make movement too expensive. When the funeral smoke faded into the winter sky, it carried more than souls. It carried a message that haunted Mongol dreams. In that valley, mathematics collided with mythology, and mythology won. The Golden Horde learned that some gold does not melt, no matter how hot the flame. Within months, the lessons of the Nameless Valley spread across the north. Deny space, deny speed, turn forests into weapons. Mongol advances slowed, cautious where once they had been unstoppable. Novgorod never fell. The northern forests remained contested for years. and in the meticulous Mongol chronicles, the valley does not exist. Defeat was beneath record. To write it down would be to admit that the mandate of heaven had limits. But legends don't need permission. The tale of Bajorn spread beyond the Roselands. In Scandinavia, warriors heard of distant cousins who had made the world's conquerors bleed. In Constantinople, the Varangian Guard added new verses to their songs. Even among the Mongols, whispers circulated of a cursed valley guarded by northern demons. Modern soldiers still study battles like this. Thermopylae, Rorke's Drift, moments where terrain and will multiplied fighting power beyond logic. The Varangian 100 wrote their lesson in blood and snow. Empires thrive on inevitability. Break the myth, and the empire bleeds everywhere. When spring thaw came, it revealed mass graves, thousands of arrowheads, and at the center, a great fire pit where heroes were given to flame. The shield wall did not merely hold, it became legend. The Viking age did not end with a whisper. It ended with 100 axes drinking deeply of empire's blood. In that frozen valley, the North reminded the world that courage could still defy arithmetic. They came as conquerors. They left as storytellers of defeat.